And welcome. It's Monday and time for the Deal Doctor live stream. It's 1 o'clock, 1:01 actually, I guess as my clock says. Eric and I were having a conversation about commercial real estate, and that sort of led into issues that are involved in commercial real estate. One of the biggest issues that we find with commercial real estate is due diligence as it regards environmental issues. If you ever become involved in commercial real estate, always recommend to your clients that they want to have a phase 1 environmental study done, or a BEA, a baseline environmental assessment. And the reason is those tests, those reviews may reveal some issues that could be of concern. For example, let's pretend that you're selling a pizza shop, but years ago, the pizza shop was a gas station. Well, there's some environmental issues there, because sometimes these buildings get renovated and nobody really knows what was in there before. I know of one situation where it was a laundromat, not a laundromat, but a laundry place where you took your laundry and had it starched and cleaned and dry cleaned and so on. Well, the dry cleaning chemicals seeped down into the ground. It wasn't in a location, it was in a storefront in a small middle of the block in a small town. Nobody would have thought that this was a laundromat 50 years ago. And so once they got in there and started doing their business, people started noticing that there was an odor, and that odor was more and more irritating. Well, as it turned out, the fumes from the chemicals used in the dry cleaning were seeping up through the old cracks in the old wooden floors. And so now we have an environmental problem. Now we've got to tear up the floor, go down and remove the soil that's underneath and replace it, and obviously repair the floor. And that can get very, very expensive. I know of one situation, it's actually fairly well known, where a real estate broker used to have a underground storage tank that he had installed to fill up his Lincoln Continental or Lincoln Town Car, whatever it was, in the morning. And he had it right there on his property, so it was nice and convenient. Unfortunately, over the years, that fuel tank started to leak. And it leaked, and it leaked, and it leaked, and it leaked. And it leaked some more. Until the entire path going downhill underneath Honey Creek Avenue out in Ada, down toward the Rogue River, was saturated with petroleum. Then the DEQ found out about it when they were doing soil tests for work on the roadbed. And guess what? They tracked it right back to that underground storage tank. I believe the bill for that was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $500,000 that the property owner got to pay because that was the source of the leak. Well, let's pretend for a moment that he had sold the property in the meanwhile, before it was discovered. Whose fault would it be, or who would be responsible for cleaning it up? Guess what? The answer is everyone. Not just the person who caused the damage initially, but anyone who is in the chain of ownership. So it could happen that this person put the tank in, it started leaking, somebody bought it completely unaware during the 5 or 10 years that they owned the property, and then somebody else bought it, and somebody else bought it. All of those people would be responsible for the mitigation of that contamination. So it's environmental issues are something to be very, very careful of, and most often come up in commercial situations, especially things like asbestos. If you go into old schools, for example, I know of a number of old schools that have been turned into condominiums. Guess what one of the first things the developer does? First thing the developer does is he calls the environmental folks to come in, the environmental inspectors to come in and determine whether or not there is asbestos in the school. Because asbestos was used as an insulation and fire retardant back decades ago, but it's still in many schools. If you go down the basement and look up, you'll see it has been sprayed on the girders underneath. So how do you get rid of that stuff? Well, it's really expensive. They have to essentially seal off the entire building and remove it and have it sucked out by a vacuum cleaner, a huge vacuum cleaner essentially, as they're removing it from the property, so that there's no residual asbestos left in the property after it's done. A phase 1 and B baseline environmental assessment in the commercial world will also tell you what other kinds of businesses could be contaminants. There is I know of one restaurant in town, in Grand Rapids area, that is located in an old hardware building that had paints and thinners and paint stripping equipment, materials. So turpentines and all of those things. And I have to wonder whether anyone ever told this restaurant owner, or whether an environmental study was ever done for that restaurant before it opened as a restaurant. I can't imagine how it would feel to go in there and unconsciously take in fumes that might still be lingering. Fumes is a huge part. But when you're involved in the commercial business, you want to do soil samples if there's been underground storage tanks and so on. You want to make sure that those tanks haven't leaked. Well, what's so different about residential? Don't we owe residential customers, buyers, the same due diligence? If we know that there's an underground oil tank or an underground petroleum tank, don't we have the due diligence to find out for our buyers whether or not there's been any soil damage? And if there has, what are the municipal requirements for that underground storage tank? Some municipalities require that the fire marshal be present and have it removed. Do you know, when you list a property, whether there's an underground storage tank? You should. You should find out if there's any sign of a pipe sticking up or a pipe coming into a property that doesn't have some place it goes outside. It's probably worth investigating. Let's talk a little bit about radon. Radon is a naturally created byproduct of the breakdown in uranium. And in that process, as the uranium breaks down, it's a radioactive material, it's a carcinogen. And so what happens is the radon vapors come up through the ground. The radon works its way up through the ground. Now, here's an interesting thing. The results of a radon test are going to vary widely on a number of factors. For example, I'll draw you a picture of a house. This house. And during the winter time, late winter, midwinter, there is a frost line that is created by the cold weather. Now, if you've got radon vapors coming up, they go to the path of least resistance. They are blocked by that frost line. You may also find that in clay areas where the ability to penetrate that clay is very difficult, it will find its way into the basement through the cracks, sump pumps, and so on. So the variation of the radon results are very wide based on the conditions in which the test was taken. Not only the test or the conditions of the, whether it is frost or soil components. Rain, a heavy soaking rain will make a difference because it will not permit the radon to come up through the ground and into the air and dissipate into the atmosphere as it would normally. So be very aware that when you're dealing with radon, you need to know, and you get a high reading, for example, you need to know how that test was conducted, when that test was conducted, and in what conditions the test was conducted. Sometimes, I had one situation that involved an inspector here in town, in Grand Rapids area, who touts himself as a buyer's advocate. Well, this buyer's advocate killed a deal for me because when he went to do the radon test, he put a canister in a room, a 6x10 room, where the sump pump was located, and he closed the door. It was an enclosed room, 6x10, with a sump pump in that room. And it was in the dead of winter, and there was a frost line there. Well, of course the test skewed high. The test skewed about 2 or 3 points above the 4.0 picocuries that the EPA deems as the safe limit for radon in a home. My seller ended up being required to install a active mitigation system, what they call a negative pressure system, where I call it a vacuum cleaner. You can call it what you want. But that system basically sucks air out and propels it through, guides it up through the house, through the roof, and into the air. Okay? That's an active mitigation system. There's also a passive mitigation system. That's where you get a sump pump crock, for example, that has a seal around it, that it shuts off the ability of the radon that goes into the sump pump to get into the inside of the home. Sealing off cracks in the cement floor or in the foundation is going with something like silicone or basement cement, that sort of thing, is going to limit the amount of radon that can get into a house. Very often you can drop radon results 2 or 3 points simply by passive mitigation system things like filling cracks and putting a sump pump crock in, a sealed sump pump crock, and get it down below the 4.0 picocurie limit. So be aware that sometimes the inspectors who are doing radon inspections out there either intentionally skew it to protect the buyer, or they simply don't know what they're doing. They don't know what the EPA guidelines are. There is no certification that I'm aware of for a radon inspector. But there are legitimate radon experts out there who do follow the EPA guidelines. So be aware when you're hiring someone to do a radon test, what's their background? How do they do the test? It's best if they do a 2-day electronic pulse rather than a canister. Have all the doors open. Have the the reader 3 feet off the ground in the center of the basement, for example. So a number of issues that you need to study up on radon for. Asbestos. Asbestos is, as I said, very often found in schools and factories, but it's also found in homes. And when you go see an old octopus furnace, it ought to raise red flags with you. You ought to be able to look at that furnace and determine whether or not there might be what's called friable asbestos. That's when it gets kind of crispy and old and crackly, and it gets into the air. Friable asbestos is a carcinogen. Asbestos is a carcinogen, and when it's friable, it can get into the air and ultimately into the lungs. Do you know what vermiculite is? It's another form of insulation, which is dangerous because it's a carcinogen. How do you determine whether these things are, in fact, asbestos? Well, you get somebody to test it who's knowledgeable, who has the experience to do it right, and send it to a testing lab to find out whether it is, in fact, asbestos. And very often, treating the asbestos, sometimes they'll tell you to leave it alone. Other times they might tell you to spray paint it and keep it in place. Again, get an expert. Don't be the expert. Get an expert to tell you how your seller or a buyer can remediate these environmental issues. Mold. There is a lot of myth about mold. The first thing I hear when I get a call is, well, we found mold in the property. Okay, and so what? Well, there's mold. There's black mold. There's toxic mold. Do we know that this particular species of mold is a problem? Is it toxic? Does it cause allergic reactions, physical reactions? Certain types of mold are benign. They won't harm anyone. Others are highly toxic and will and can reproduce rapidly. Did you send it to a lab? Do you know that this is an issue? No. So a lot of times agents will just run away from a house because there's a mold issue. It's another experience that I had with mold. They found mold in the attic, and not surprisingly, it was directly above the bathroom, where the bathroom vent released all of the moisture that occurred during a shower or, general use of the bathroom. So it collected in the rafters above, up in the attic, and it had caused mold. And my buyer called me and said, well, what do I do? Do I ask for it to be removed and so on? Well, my brother-in-law happens to be an environmental expert, owns an environmental evaluation company, and does work throughout the country. And I called him and I said, what's the best remedy here? What do you recommend? And his answer was, go to Meyer and buy some new roof vents, because I will virtually guarantee that 2 or 3 of the roof vents have been stepped on or damaged in some manner and are not functioning properly. Put those roof vents in, and in about 6 months to a year, when there's proper ventilation within the roof, within the attic, the mold will die. It's that simple. I said, really, you wouldn't go up and spray it with bleach or something? He says, oh, no. No, that's the worst thing you can do. Then you're just going to spread it around. So go get vents, put the vents in, see what happens. Test it 6 months from now. We did that. We tested it 6 months from now. The mold was dead. It was all gone. It was the discoloration was still somewhat there, but there was no active mold. There was no live mold left because the natural ventilation of the construction allowed it to die like it was supposed to. And yes, somebody had stepped on a couple of the roof vents when they were up there on the roof and had no idea whatsoever of the impact that it would have. So read as much as you can about things like mold, asbestos, radon, baseline environmental studies, soil samples. But here's a biggie. We run into a lot of purchase agreements in the residential area that talk about having well and septic inspections. And sometimes there's a disagreement about well and septic inspections because, in my view, the language of the purchase agreement, the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, and other purchase agreements is vague about whether or not a well and septic inspection must be performed. I tell every agent who's writing for a buyer, make sure you write specifically in there that the seller is going to order and pay for a well and septic inspection and provide it to the buyer. If the buyer finds unacceptable results, they have the right to terminate the contract. So, I don't know why any agent working for a buyer would not have a well tested if the house has a well, especially with PFAS, especially if it's anywhere near a PFAS zone. But it doesn't even have to be near a PFAS zone. There are many other areas that we haven't discovered yet. Again, another war story. I sold a house on the street called Lantana years ago, out in Kentwood. And I didn't know that the house backed up to what ultimately became a Superfund site. It's where manufacturers like Steelcase and various others, General Motors and so on, it's where they dump their heavy metal paints, thinners, all of that stuff that they use in the manufacture and painting and so on of their products. This thing was a mess. This place, this whole thing had toxic waste going everywhere. And this house lot, the lot for this house, sat directly adjacent to it. And nobody knew it. The listing agent, I was the listing agent, I didn't know it. The sellers didn't know it. It wasn't until after the EPA came along and said, wow, we have a problem here. Now, as it turned out, they had soil samples done on this particular property, and they sealed off the toxic waste dump, the Superfund site, with clay barriers and so on. But the seller, when they went to sell, the owner, when they went to sell, had to disclose that they were in proximity to a Superfund site, to an environmental problem area. And so we don't know what's going to happen in the future regarding things like that and PFAS. But even a well should be tested for coliform. I don't know any reason to waive that on an inspection even if the buyer really, really, really wants the house, I think it's one of those things where it's really important that they know what they're getting into, especially when it comes to environmental issues and potential health issues with the well and lead in the water and all of those things, radon, mold, all of those things. So be very aware, keep it at the top of your mind that environmental issues are important. They're important to learn about, and they are important to communicate to your potential seller and or buyer about. So I hope that helps a little. It's just sort of a tip of the iceberg, because you can go on and Google a lot of stuff, talk to experts, talk to as many experts as you can to learn more about these environmental issues, and then you'll be able to inform your clients better in the future. So hope you're enjoying the holiday season, and I will see you here next week. Thanks.